It's wonderful to be here today. I have always enjoyed coming to Austin, and it's lovely to see you all again and see you for the first time. Today I'll be talking about demographic trajectories and the life course timing of gender transitions that happen in adulthood. And I'll tell you a little bit why we're focusing on adulthood in a moment, but again, we're kind of thinking about those midlife experiences and later life experiences. This work is done in collaboration with Lucas Tilley and Ylva Moberg, who are at the Swedish Institute for Social Research, which is a very cool organization that just provides access for scholars, and also they do their own research with Swedish administrative data. So if you're not familiar with the kind of Nordic country model, everything that could be known about you is known about you by the government in this context. And so it's a very cool opportunity for research. And so I've connected with those folks to just be able to offer a new perspective on gender identity across the life course, because this isn't really data that we have available in the United States or something that we could even replicate in our context. So I'll talk a little bit today about why we need a life course perspective for gender identity development. A lot of this work is focused on adolescence and even childhood, but we're missing something, right? And so we'll expand that today. I'll tell you a little bit about these Swedish data in terms of the context that they come from, what we can know about folks, as well as present some findings around demographic transitions that are happening within an individual's life as they approach this kind of period of medical gender transition, including things like around partnerships and co-residence with children in particular. So sort of thinking about family and relationships as someone approaches this moment where they initiate a medical gender transition in later life. And then we can talk a little bit about what comes next, why that's important, and other elements that we're kind of thinking about in terms of ways to expand this work. So to get you kind of situated, we have this big national conversation around gender affirming care right now. It's very politicized. This research area is very robust though, and has been for over 20 years, kind of thinking about how kids and adolescents and young adults really develop their gender identity. And this work has kind of tried to think about prevalence. So the most recent work here has shown that actually quite a few kids in our US context start to think about gender expansive, gender diverse, gender creative is another term that's used here, identities by middle childhood and adolescence. And to put some numbers to that, those estimates, depending on what kinds of restrictions we put on the data and where we're talking about, what kind of data we have, might range anywhere from 1.3 to 2.7% for folks who specifically identify as transgender, but a much broader range, up to 8.5% of kids and young adults identifying in a broader set of gender expansive kinds of ways. So including non-binary and other gender fluid kinds of identities. So quite a lot of population here, especially in that young population. And a lot of the research has focused on this period because we think about adolescence in particular as this really critical moment in somebody's life when they kind of really start to consolidate who they are in a lot of ways, right? Their identities around a lot of things, including gender. Right? And so we tend to think about this moment as this time when it's really important to get access to gender affirming care if a gender expansive or transgender identity is expressed. It's a really important moment for social and other kinds of legal affirmation here, right? School-based affirmation is another space where we're kind of thinking about these issues. Parental affirmation is another area. And so it's really this critical moment in the literature. We know that those different kinds of affirmation are associated with lower levels of suicidality in that population, and that especially when we combine high acceptance or affirmation with low levels of rejection, right, we get much better outcomes for these kids in terms of mental health in the moment and over time. All right. We haven't thought a lot about what happens to folks who do this at a different point in their life, beyond adolescence, right? So we've spent all of this time thinking about folks who initiate a gender transition when they're 15, when they're 18, when they're 22, right? The median age here is in the mid-20s in the United States. But we have lots of reasonable data now coming from community surveys like the US Transgender Survey that shows us people actually do this at other times in their life too, right? So a large portion of folks start to have these, questioning or assertions of a different gender identity later in life, after age 30. In fact, many even after age 50. Right? I've seen in my own data, which is longitudinal data of older LGBTQ adults in the South, that people, over age 50 are still kind of wrestling with their gender, how to express that, how to assert that, how to claim it on a survey, right? And so we do see change over a 4-year period in how people identify their gender in that sample that I have of 50 plus older adults, age 50 plus. And so, why is this happening? Well, we're in a particular historical moment where there's a lot more visibility. There's a lot more healthcare access. There are more models of transgender folks in media, in social spaces. There's certainly there has been a move towards more affirmation and acceptance in many spaces. We're also experiencing a backlash in that space. We can't neglect that as well. We have also seen, I think there's also just folks who experience this in a different way, where later in life, they have different motivations, they have different desires, different relationships that change who they are and who they want to be, right? And how they want to be in the world. So there are all of these things kind of coalescing in this moment. And when we do look at folks who transition in midlife and later life, so outside of that adolescence and youth space, we see very similar results, right? They still have improvements in mental health, and they still have improvements in their quality of life, right? These are meaningful changes that are happening in these folks' lives. But we still don't know very much about them, right? We have a few qualitative studies on why people initiate a later in life gender change. We have, a little bit of work that's able to look at outcomes, but we really don't know that much about them. And so I'll be addressing some of that with this study. We stopped working. Okay. No, we're not doing this either. There we go. Cool. Okay. So here's a little bit about what we do know. So there have been a few studies in this space that have tried to, they're mostly focused actually still on the adolescent kind of piece, but we have this kind of nice picture across the life course in terms of folks that are initiating medical gender transition by receiving a gender dysphoria diagnosis, which is often kind of this first stage of engaging with the medical space around a gender identity, around a gender change. And so this is coming from a paper by Sun and colleagues published in General Psychiatry in 2023. And they look across 2017 to 2021 at multiple US medical centers. So this is healthcare administrative data, essentially. They're looking at patients, individual patients. They are across many medical centers and include a few that are not in the US as well, in Canada. And what they're able to show that you see in this graph is that the prevalence of new gender dysphoria diagnoses is increasing. You see that with the banded bars, right? Going from dark to light. Light is 2021 in that greenish color at the top. And so you do see this increasing prevalence of diagnosis. These are estimated rates per 100,000 population here that they've extrapolated from their patient population. Which they identified trans folks based on ICD-10 codes in this paper. So they're able to look at specifically that gender dysphoria diagnosis. You also see that graph is sort of leaning to the left, right? That way for you. It's starting to lean a bit more to the left, right? So that the diagnosis is occurring at younger ages, year over year, right? But what I want you to also see is that this is not zero. Right? This out here is not zero in terms of what's going on here. And we can also, they have a second picture here, we can also disaggregate that by sex assigned at birth. And so what we often see when we disaggregate here is that folks who have been assigned female at birth have earlier transition timing in terms of initiation than folks who are assigned male at birth. And we have this in the blue line, this longer kind of sustained shelf in terms of later transitions that's happening, where that whole curve has kind of shifted more to the right, and you just have more area under the curve kind of in that midlife space over age 30 for people assigned male at birth. And that's pretty consistent across data sources as well. So I've done a little bit of work with with the graphs that they've shown in terms of estimating some of these areas under the curve to get a sense of what's actually going on age-wise, right? So in the kind of grayish green here, you see the new diagnoses that are occurring under age 30, right? So those kind of typical representations of adolescence and young adulthood. And those are an increasing share, right? By 2021, they're making up about 60% of new gender dysphoria diagnoses, which again is that like initiation point to accessing gender affirming medical care in our healthcare system in many spaces. But what I also want you to see is that kind of purple color and black color, the kind of midlife and later life transitions that are also being initiated in this space are still non-trivial, right? 30 to 40%, depending over time in terms of where we're thinking about, and that 50 to 65 age group is actually quite stable over this time period, right? So we have a lot of, 1 in 10 people who are initiating a gender change during this time period, 2017 to 2021, are over age 50. Right? And so another reason to kind of be thinking about this space, they are not a non-zero kind of population here. Just to give you another sense, we do have very limited data in this space, but another study of Medicare beneficiaries, Medicare again is accessible to folks over 65, but in other circumstances might be accessible to some folks younger, right? We see when we look at the claims, the billable claims to Medicare, that over 2,000 gender affirming surgeries were conducted and paid for by Medicare, and that when we actually look at who's getting those, more than half of those are among people who identify as transgender over age 50, right? They can also use this with like Medicare, Medicaid dual eligibility. So there are some other folks that are below the age requirements here. But in general, we see about half of these folks are over age 50. So again, kind of supporting this idea that a lot of change is still happening in the gender identity and expression kind of space for people later in life. Again, also to look at that gender and assigned sex at birth kind of distinction here, to kind of assess by gender in terms of the age as well. People who are assigned male at birth, as we kind of saw that curve shift over, right, are much more likely to initiate medical gender transition care in midlife and later life. And that proportion, as you see kind of on the right here, is substantially higher in those ages 30 to 49 and 50 plus. Almost half of people assigned male at birth are initiating gender change, medical gender change after age 30, right? Whereas with people assigned female at birth, that's much lower at like 30% or so. So again, we have kind of good information that this is happening, that there might be some important distinctions here in terms of process or the people that this is happening to. It's also replicated in other contexts. So I can show you a little bit about what's going on in the Swedish context. And similar to the US context, we see this kind of really strong, increase, especially among younger people, regardless of sex assigned at birth, in terms of uptake of new gender transition, like medical care, right? As well as legal gender change in the Swedish context, which you have to wait 2 years as you've like lived in your preferred gender to kind of to be able to access. So we see that that increases both with medical gender change, which is on the top, and legal gender change, which is on the bottom here. And this is including among people who are aged 30 to 39, 40 to 49, and 50 plus. Right, so those lines are the green and yellow lines that you see. Certainly that's less than the younger cohorts here, but it's not flat and non-zero. And then as you see on the right-hand side of the screen as well, we see that there are again these kind of sex differences by sex assigned at birth, with folks who are assigned female at birth having this kind of stronger increase over time in terms of uptake of medical and legal gender change in the Swedish context. So just to summarize what we know that initiation of medical gender change has been increasing, that a lot of that increase has been happening for folks who are in the youngest cohorts, but that the change that is still happening for people who are ages 30 to 65 is non-trivial and about 40% overall. And that share over age 50 has remained stable since 2017 and is a substantial part of the number of folks who, or the share of folks who are initiating medical gender change in the US context. And then finally, we can think about differences in age and initiation by sex assigned at birth, with this kind of idea that folks who are assigned male at birth are initiating medical gender transition later in life than people assigned female at birth. So this is what we kind of can tell from the existing work here. That's about all we know, right? In terms of who these folks are or what's going on with them. And so my, work in this space has really been to try to think about what are the other things we can and should and could know about what's going on leading up to and perhaps after medical gender change in this population. And so we've thought a lot about what's going on in this purple space, right, among youth and young adults in the terms of gender identity development. We know a lot about how it happens, what kinds of things matter, whether the presence of affirmation, the lack of rejection all matter, right? Whether there's healthcare access, the social environment, the school environment, these things all matter. There's also, individual development, psychological processes happening in terms of identity development. There's been a lot of work in this space. What we need, I think, to expand here is a way to think about the rest of the curve, right? The rest of the life course. And so I've started thinking about these new periods of gender exploration and assertion that are associated with changes in relationships. Maybe you get divorced, maybe a parent dies, maybe other things in your life change either through your own agency or happen to you in terms of creating opportunity and space to assert or express or experiment with presenting yourself differently. Other things change as well outside of you without your agency, right? The policies change. We've seen that a lot in the last 15 years with policies kind of being much more affirmative in some spaces, and then now kind of this backlash where we're kind of taking those opportunities away, not only for young people, but also, I live in Tennessee, also, gender affirming care for everyone is kind of up for grabs by the legislature. And so that becomes challenging. Healthcare access has changed quite a bit. There was a massive expansion in terms of access, in terms of clinics, in terms of providers. That is now also shrinking, right? As providers have experienced this backlash personally. They receive death threats, they receive, threats related to their jobs. They leave to go to other environments that are more affirming or maybe change what they do entirely, right? We can also see differences in social environment that have changed, created space for more of this gender exploration in later life, and also seen those contractions as well. And so ultimately what we can think about is that the shape of this curve is going to depend quite a lot on where you are, when you are, what kinds of access to healthcare you have, what the policy environment looks like, what your social and family environment looks like. And I think, we can also compare that across contexts to show that the shape of this curve is going to be quite different if we were looking in Minnesota, for example, versus Texas, or other spaces where we have lots of clinics versus this kind of shrinking of space for access to gender affirming care, or different kinds of conversations that are going on internationally around whether or not kids under 18 should have access to gender affirming care, these kinds of things. Why do we need this model? I think for a lot of reasons, including, one is just to be more inclusive and really represent the data well, but also because I think these folks are actually navigating something kind of different, right? They are not 15 or 18 or 22. They are folks who are, embedded in families that they have created, as opposed to their families of origin. They have jobs or careers. They may have kids. Right? They have other things that are going on in their lives that adolescents usually aren't dealing with, in terms of what's happening. That creates new opportunities. It also creates new risks, right? In some ways, they might be, protected from some of the risks that adolescents face, right? Like many transgender adolescents end up unhoused or in a family of origin that rejects those identities, and they can only kind of express those once they leave the home. These are folks who already have kind of moved beyond likely that space and have new constraints. They have new risks. We see a lot of underemployment and self-employment for trans folks, especially approaching that transition, in terms of job loss, right? We see lower wages across the lifespan for trans folks. And so even though their financial position might be more secure than, say, a 16-year-old's or a 22-year-old's, for that matter, who might be independent, there's not zero risk here, right? There's just different risks. And so there's, I think, other things to be thinking about, how those relationships change, how jobs change, what, other kinds of things might be changing at the same time, like health shocks, right, for example, other aging elements. There's an opportunity here to think beyond just what's happening with youth and young adults and gender identity development specifically. Additionally, this has a lot of relevance for policy and clinical guidelines. A lot of our clinical guidelines and recommendations are built around adolescence. We're thinking about early initiation. We're thinking about puberty blockers. We're thinking about whether minors should have access to life-changing surgeries, et cetera. We're not kind of thinking about what happens to folks who are adults, right, who are well beyond this puberty stage, right? What should be those kinds of guidelines in terms of the clinical relevance, in terms of legal access to gender-affirming care for this population. So the kind of thesis I'd like to kind of present to you today, and we'll show you more about in terms of the data, is that I really think that transition timing affects the meaning, the context and consequences of transition in ways that make this population really unique and distinct and worth studying in their own terms, in terms of thinking about what's going on with gender identity transition in midlife and later life. So to tell you a little bit about Sweden, we're going to travel to Sweden and think about data. So they offer this really unique window to think about gender identity development in midlife and later life, because they have this early legal recognition starting in 1972 and then effective 1973. They're able to, folks are able to legally change their gender in Sweden beginning in 1973. And this is, creates a lot of opportunity, but also is accompanied by some very strong kinds of barriers to access here in terms of medical gender change. So, we can think about legal change where my documents match my presentation. We can think about social change, social transition, right, where just I live as who I am and my, identity is expressed and respected by other folks in my social environment. And then we can also think about medical gender change, right? So where I can modify my body to match the gender that I am expressing. And so we have legal gender change. Certainly people can socially transition without access to legal or medical transition. But we also can think about this medical gender change, which was restricted from 1980 to 2000 in the Swedish context, because they also required, if you wanted to go forward with a medical gender transition, that you consent to sterilization. So the removal of your reproductive organs that could that held your reproductive material, right? So the removal of ovaries or testes, right? This is a very high bar for a lot of folks to get over in terms of what they want to do. Not only does it foreclose your opportunities at reproduction, it's an invasive surgery for everyone. It's certainly meaningful, right, in terms of how you think about your body. And so this is a very high bar. We see very few medical gender changes prior to this because that is a bar that is there. And this is a major institutional barrier for folks that prevented both legal gender marker change and medical transition. This is abolished in 2013. So I'll show you data that includes the 2013 period, and you can see it's like takes off, right? Once that requirement is repealed. But overall, for the analytic window, just because we're able to have pretty high quality data prior to that 2013 space, we're going to look all the way back to 2005 up to 2020 in terms of getting really high quality data on at the population level. So again, this is everyone in Sweden. This isn't a sample. This is everyone in Sweden, where we're able to see that initiation of medical gender change, and based on their first diagnosis, that kind of gets them in the system where they're able to access gender affirming care. What we don't know, importantly, we don't have information on how they identify. In terms of their actual gender identity, right? So I don't know that they identify as transgender or non-binary or something else. I only know that they are assigned some sex at birth and they are transitioning, medically, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about folks who are assigned male or female at birth, and we'll kind of assign them an identity as transgender men and transgender women. This is an assumption and not reflected in the data. We also don't know anything about people who don't initiate medical gender transition in this context, which could be many, many people, right? So you can pursue legal marker change without a medical change. You can certainly pursue social transition without any of these other things. So we only know about people who are like at the bar of wanting to change their bodies to match their gender expression. Okay, so who do we have? So we look at the Swedish National Patient Register. This is going to give us information on anybody living in Sweden who's accessing healthcare in Sweden. And so within this space, we can see specifically folks who have a gender incongruence diagnosis. This is our version or their version of gender dysphoria diagnosis. That says like your gender doesn't match your sex assigned at birth. And these were available from gender clinics in the outpatient context since 2001. So we're able to look at that. It's fairly accessible. In the Swedish system, your out-of-pocket healthcare costs are capped at $100 annually. So it's very accessible. Someone with a $4,000 deductible, I am like very in favor of this moment with $100 out-of-pocket cap. So what do they know? The Statistics Sweden knows quite a lot. So they know all the demographic characteristics that someone might report on, say, the census. They know their civil status in terms of whether they're in a legal union, cohabiting, not cohabiting with anyone, roommates with people. They know all these kinds of things about where they live, household composition. They know all the jobs you've had ever. They know your grades back to first grade. So there's a very intriguing and also scary kind of moment in terms of administrative data, right, where you can think about a lot of different kinds of questions, right? And so invariably this team and its expansion set in Sweden has been doing just that, right? Thinking about education trajectories of transgender folks, employment trajectories, et cetera, right? So getting to know them on lots of different measures. And I would just say that these teams all include folks who identify as transgender and non-binary, which I think is really critical to that work being done well. Our focal measure for this study is going to be, again, that earliest gender incongruence diagnosis. So that thing that triggers your access to gender affirming medical care in this context, which is required by everyone. So you have to get this first clinic appointment and you have to get that diagnosis to be able to move forward to any kind of endocrine or surgical kinds of procedures. And again, we're looking 2005 to 2020. What we're going to do is actually set up a panel where we have folks who've lived in Sweden for at least 6 years, and then prior to their transition. So their transition year is their event time, right? Like that's their T. And then we're going to look backwards 6 years to basically set up a panel to see what happens to folks in those preceding years, right? Especially around coupling with a partner, especially around co-residence with kids. But in our kind of expanded version of this, we'll look at a lot of different kinds of preceding things that happen. In our sample, we have 1,243 individuals at first diagnosis who are age 30 or older, including 791 folks who are assigned male at birth and 452 people who are assigned female at birth. And again, that window is 6 years prior to diagnosis. Methodologically, we're going to do a few different things here. The first thing that we're going to do is compare our sample of folks who transitioned over age 30 to their same sex assigned at birth peers who never transitioned, so to cisgender folks. And because we have quite a lot of those also in our data, we'll actually reduce that sample to a 1 to 100 sample. So we'll match each person who's transitioning later in life to 100 cisgender peers from the same birth year and the same sex assigned at birth, right? So they're sex matched and age matched people. The second thing that we're going to do is try to think about whether or not that timing of transition matters for some of these outcomes, right? Certainly, there's also some historical and purity effects that are happening in this space, so we can't disentangle those, but we can at least look at whether or not people who transitioned later in life are different from people of the same sex assigned at birth and same birth year that transitioned earlier in life, so before age 30. Effectively with our panel, I mentioned we have to look at folks for 6 years prior to their transition timing, so that actually makes them 24, right? The youngest person in our earlier transition sample is 24 because of the way that this panel balancing works. And the third thing that we're going to do is look at only people who transitioned later in life and compare them by sex assigned at birth, right? So to think about gendered outcomes among this cohort, right? We have to do, like the sample gets a bit thin, so we have to expand out to 2 years in terms of the matching on birth year, right? So they're not the exact same age, but they're about the same age. And we have to also match on 2-year diagnosis windows. So we have a little bit more like flexibility on those windows, but they're still quite close matches in terms of what's happening there. So this is comparing on a more like-for-like basis among people who transitioned later in life. Are there gendered differences in what we see here, which we expect based on some of that timing differential that we saw in the earlier data. So here's our distribution in terms of the age distribution of folks in our sample, color-coded by sex assigned at birth. You have folks who have been assigned female at birth in the orange. And again, you see that leaning left kind of peak much earlier in terms of accessing of medical gender transition, and that kind of longer, slower curve for the folks assigned male at birth. What we find is about 30% of the folks assigned male at birth versus 14% of folks assigned female at birth are transitioning over age 30. So again, we see that gender imbalance in terms of accessing and initiating medical gender change in midlife and later life. And you can see the sample sizes here. We have 936 folks diagnosed over age 30 and 549 diagnosed over age 30 when we were kind of thinking about the 2005 and onward sample. Just to give you a little zoom in here on the folks who are diagnosed after age 30, again, you see this higher prevalence of folks assigned male at birth, and that's persistent throughout this entire kind of age range that we have here, and even like the the gap grows in the later age periods, right? So over age 45, we're seeing an increase again in that gap, with many more people assigned male at birth being represented here. Again, over time, we're also seeing this prevalence increasing over time. So as we saw in those earlier data that were focused on prevalence increasing, this is also happening in Sweden. I mentioned that 2013 space. You can see that jump there and difference in terms of slope in this line when that sterilization requirement is removed, right? So there is certainly a period effect here in terms of like that policy. There are other teams within our team that are working on that particular paper. And so I'm not focused on that today, but it is something that people are paying attention to in terms of what happens when those policies and healthcare access barriers change. And then you might be wondering, well, why does it go down like that? There's something that goes on in the Swedish context in 2019, in particular around like the national conversation around gender affirming care, which sort of decreases demand temporarily. And then you also see that 2020 COVID-19 dip, where medical gender transition was more challenging because of the challenges for the medical system overall. So the first thing that we'll look at is how partnerships are changing. How are partnerships changing for folks who are transitioning in midlife and later life, in particular compared to their peers who never transition, compared to people who transitioned earlier, who were born at the same time, right? So they're the same age, but they transitioned much earlier in life. And then also compared to folks who are their same age and same diagnosis year, but of a different sex assigned at birth. So here's our kind of first result, thinking of this is just the kind of raw shares in terms of transitioning, in terms of folks who are currently in a legal union. So there are multiple legal union types in Sweden besides just marriage. And so this includes those different legal union types. And at the top, you have the dotted line representing cisgender people, again, separated by sex assigned at birth. And so these folks are the same birth year. We're comparing those folks like in the same birth year. So we've identified the same cohort. We've created sort of a synthetic cohort here because they don't have a transition year. So we have to sort of randomize that and create one for them. But as you kind of see, you see that line kind of increasing basically with time, right? In terms of what's happening here. To orient you to the graph, that time zero is the time they have the earliest diagnosis of gender incongruence. So they're accessing medical transition related care. And then you're looking backwards, basically. So 6 years prior, we see lower levels of marriage and other union formation, and we see that increasing for cisgender folks. For folks who transition earlier in life, below age 30, that's the kind of light purple line with the this looks like barbed wire to me, the X's. You see that also kind of steadily increasing. It's certainly starting at a lower place. That's consistent with them being younger in that moment. And increasing. And for our later life transitioners on the assigned male at birth side, we see that kind of share is higher initially and decreases over time leading up to that medical transition, right? On the right hand, or on the right hand side for you, you see very similar patterns for the cisgender folks with a slightly increased, top line there, as well as our two early and later transitioner lines tracking on a similar slope, but at a much lower level, right? And we do see some changes that are happening with our later life transitioner group. I'll show you the event study in just a second to show you how significant those differences are by group. But in general, that line is trending positive, right? So we don't see the same kind of drop off as we do with the folks assigned male at birth. This is the event study using two-way fixed effects models here to identify those differences between groups. And so we're starting at time -6, and it's showing you the change over time up to that transition moment, or that initiation of medical transition moment. And so for people assigned male at birth, especially that late transitioner group, folks who are accessing care over age 30, in this space, we do see a significant decline relative to the prevalence of being in a legal union 6 years prior, as they approach, especially the year before and the year of their medical transition initiation. On the other side, for folks assigned female at birth, we actually see them increasing, significantly increasing their presence in a current legal union. And so that's this darker line, right? And so especially in the year, in the 2 years prior to, medical gender transition, we see a significant increase in their presence in a legal union, right? So we have really different things happening here. We have people who are assigned male at birth actually exiting legal unions, and people assigned female at birth entering legal unions as they approach that medical transition timing. And compared to cisgender folks, these are always significantly different for our late transitioner group, and they're significantly different than the early transition group for our assigned male at birth group. But as you see on the right-hand side, our late transitioners are tracking pretty consistently and not significantly different from folks who transition earlier in life when they're assigned female at birth. Okay, when we do our age-matched comparison here by sex at birth of just our late transitioners, again, you see those differences kind of clearly. So you see the orange line where we see it above 0, and especially in those 2 years, 1 and 2 years prior, and even 3 years prior to diagnosis, they're increasing their presence in legal unions. That difference here ultimately is significant by the time that they are accessing medical gender change in terms of what's going on in terms of presence in a current legal union. The next thing that we'll look at is how relationships with children in the home are changing prior to transition, again, by these same 3 comparison groups. And so here's again the raw shares in terms of what's happening with co-residence with children. So unsurprisingly, we see that over half of folks who are cisgender in this age group are co-resident with children over age 30. That share is increasing over time, as you see across the x-axis. And for our people assigned male at birth, you see slightly different patterns here, right? So you see the early life transitioners being very unlikely, right, in fact, to have kids in the home leading up to their transition. We see again that kind of flat to potentially decreased presence of children in the home for folks assigned male at birth who are transitioning later in life. So potentially consistent with a story where they're leaving a home with kids as they transition. Whereas for folks assigned female at birth, they're much more likely to be in homes that are adding kids for the first time, right? Co-residing with kids as they approach this gender transition, especially when they're early life transition, when they're experiencing an early life transition. For our later life transition folks, that line is essentially flat, and we see that in our event study as well. Right. So here's the event study, again showing you that decline in co-residence with children, reaching significance for our people assigned male at birth by the time of their medical transition, whereas this is generally flat for folks who are assigned female at birth, transitioning later in life, and not really tracking in the same way with folks who transition earlier in life or with cisgender folks who never transition, right, which are both increasing over time. Okay. When we do our age-matched comparison here, one thing that you'll see is that these are very overlapping. Certainly our confidence intervals are very wide here, but these are essentially flat and very similar lines. Why is this the case? In our sample, folks who are assigned female at birth, transitioning later in life, are substantially younger by about 5 years compared to folks who are transitioning later in life who are assigned male at birth, who are about 5 years older on average. And so just because of the dynamics of aging and when you have kids, they are already less likely to have kids in the home, and that is largely compositional, is what I'm showing you here. That these are, if we reweight the assigned female at birth sample to look like our assigned male at birth sample in those later life transition groups, we don't see those differences. So the differences that we see here are largely due to the composition of age for our later transitioner group in terms of whether they're above or below that line in terms of co-residence with children. So just to sum up some of our findings here, the age of transition, we see a larger share of people transitioning at age 30 or older overall among people assigned male at birth, transitioning to be trans women. And these transitions are concentrated in the ages 40 and 50, whereas with people assigned female at birth, we see a smaller share transitioning at age 30 or older overall. And those transitions are more likely to be concentrated in the 30s as opposed to the 40s and 50s, which is meaningful for that co-residence with children piece I just mentioned. In terms of coupling, we see higher union rates in the early pre-period for people assigned male at birth who are transitioning later, but a decreasing presence in a union leading up to that transition, and the opposite for people assigned female at birth, where they have lower initial union rates and increasing presence in a union, as well as new partnership formation that's happening in the lead up to a medical gender transition. With kids, we see co-residence with children decreasing over the pre-period as diagnosis approaches for people assigned male at birth, and co-residence with children increasing over the pre-period as diagnosis approaches for trans men assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. And then ultimately, if we're comparing these groups, we see a large gap compared to same-age cisgender men, as well as earlier transitioning peers for people assigned male at birth on rates of coupling and co-residence with children. And we see that difference also reflected for people assigned female at birth on that difference in coupling, but in a different direction where they're more likely to be coupled. But we still see differences in trajectories across these three groups that are very staged in terms of what's happening at their rate shares. And then we also see co-residence with children trajectories converging more with folks assigned male at birth when we take into account their kind of stage of the life course. Why do we see some of these patterns? So to kind of give you some context to kind of think through these things, certainly we know that there are very different social costs of transition by sex assigned at birth. The literature is pretty well established that feminization is more costly than masculinization across lots of dimensions, socially, financially, related to job and career, related to partnership prospects, et cetera. That those are things that even in early childhood, parents are actively intervening on to kind of, even if like unintentionally, that drive kind of outcomes for their kids. And then we also, as I've mentioned, noticed this age difference between people assigned male at birth and people assigned female at birth who are transitioning later in life. That 5-year kind of on average gap matters quite a bit for what kinds of life experiences they're having in that moment of transition, right? Are kids leaving the household? Are kids entering your household, right? Are you in a kind of child, rearing moment with new young kids, or are you actually with older kids who are maybe in high school or leaving for college, something like this, who are exiting your household? Certainly the relational costs here may also be different. One thing that we're expanding on, we don't currently have the data on partner sex for this group, but we'll have this over the summer. And the suspicion is very strong among our team that folks who are assigned female at birth are entering partnerships that are same-sex couples, and transitioning in the context of a same-sex couple. Whereas folks who are assigned male at birth are transitioning in the context of a opposite sex or different sex partner, which has really different relational costs and expectations, and even just social acceptance. And so that's our very strong suspicion that we expect to be able to validate in the data as we get kind of the new data pull later this summer. And then finally, I think there's very likely to be differences in the effectiveness of that policy barrier that I mentioned, that sterilization requirement. In general, folks who are transitioning from female to male are much more likely to get bottom surgery than folks who are transitioning from male to female. And within that kind of process is often something like a radical hysterectomy, which is the sterilization kind of process that was included in that barrier. And so if that is more acceptable or more likely to be accessed, that policy barrier was less effective. And so folks were able to access at younger ages in this context, despite that barrier being there, just because it was less of a barrier. It was already kind of included in some of the things that some people did to medically transition. Again, what these data can and can't tell us, we're focused here specifically on medical transitions only. We don't get folks' self-reported gender identity. Our co-residence measure is currently imprecise, especially with kids. We don't know if those are the person's own kids or any other kids that could be in the household. But again, that's something that we can firm up in our next data poll over the summer. And then certainly we're being descriptive here, not causal. It's not that divorce or union formation causes gender transition. And so I think we have room here to think about how those things are changing and happening for different folks. I think what we've provided for you here is the first population level description of things that are going on in that pre-diagnosis period. In order to really expand this literature, think about a growing population, think about a population that's been there and not addressed within the context of the literature on transgender and gender identity transition, and certainly focuses our attention to the role of family and social environment and household environment for thinking about what's changing in the lives of folks accessing medical gender transition in this period of life. And then bigger picture, I think we can think about how more broadly in the sociological and demographic space about how gender transition is really embedded in people's life biographies. It is not separate from it. It is not a thing that's happening outside of it. It is happening with it, right? It is happening with coupling. It is happening with divorce. It is happening with childbearing, in ways that maybe are not straightforward all of the time or might vary, as we saw here, by age, by cohort, by, by sex assigned at birth. And certainly these pathways to transition are gendered. They're certainly cohort structured. I don't show you any comparative data here, but it certainly matters probably where you are when you're pursuing this kind of care in terms of what you get access to, which is a thing I think, but haven't shown you. And then, to kind of finalize, like thinking about the conditions under which adults do seek gender affirming care, these are really unequal, right? And I don't just mean like policy-wise or healthcare-wise, but also within the context of their relationships, right? If I'm accessing healthcare that's going to change my life in a context where I'm also navigating a divorce and separation from my kids, that's a really different experience than one that I'm navigating with a very supportive partner and with a 3-year-old, right? Like that, those are different lives. And that's meaningful, right? In terms of what we're thinking. So just to conclude, I welcome your questions, but just to conclude, thinking about how for many adults, the path to gender affirming care runs through all of these different life transitions. I've shown you information here on partnership, on children and childcare, caregiving roles, but there's more here that we could look at, right? And those pathways for folks to gender affirming care and medical gender transition are gonna look different depending on where people were born, what sex they were assigned at birth, when people were born, and so on. And I think all of these things matter and are now accessible in certain data that we can look at to try to kind of be able to map this out and contextualize those experiences more. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.